that was called Rise Up, where we, with GSB, the company that he is a partner in, raised $1.25 million to do new ministry in our synod. Mike has served both as a parish pastor and as the vice president of advancement for the camping system in the southeast U.S. that includes Luther Ridge and Luther Rock in North Carolina, and a couple of other camps. His work is primarily with capital campaigns, synod-wide or judicatory-wide appeals, congregational stewardship, and lately lots of work around strategic planning. We work with him now in the Southeast Michigan Synod, as do I think Southern Ohio and Indiana, Kentucky, in a program called Stewardship for All Seasons that has been one of the very best programs we've launched as a synod. I always tell people that there's no cookie cutter kind of process for anything in the church anymore. And while Stewardship for All Seasons isn't a cookie cutter, it is a system and a process that works in just about every single congregation that we've worked with. We see significant increases in pledged and actual giving through congregations participating in the process over a year long or 2 or 3 years with Mike as a consultant. So we're really glad we can have him here today to do this work with us, and I'm going to turn it over to him. Thanks for being here, Mike.
Oh, I'm delighted to be with you. And as I was going to bed last night, I was lamenting that we didn't do a virtual cocktail party to really make it feel like a first call retreat. But so
our synod is later.
Okay, good, excellent. So I'm delighted to be with you for at least a couple of hours today, and I'm going to do everything I can to make these topics enjoyable for you. They may not be the topics that pushed you into getting into rostered ministry, but I think they are likely topics that you get to deal with, and you need to at least have a good understanding of. And so hopefully by the time we're finished, you'll at least like the topics if they currently are topics that you run from. I know strategic planning can make some rostered leaders' eyes glaze over. But I'm going to give you some reasons why it's critically important, and especially important today. We're going to do 3 topics. I trust, Heather or Lauren, you're on my screen, so thumbs up that my screen is being shared. Okay, excellent. So we're gonna talk about three primary topics: having an effective council, developing stewardship, and strategic planning. For us in our firm, we have what we call the 10 steps for nonprofits to be successful, and so these are the first 3 steps. They're also articulated in a book that Fortress Press published that I wrote this year called Abundance, and so you can certainly find more about what we'll be talking about there. But everything I do, I want to relate to the crisis that we're currently in, that is this pandemic. And so sometimes it takes a crisis like this to expose some things in our congregations. You know, has this shown you that the council has to make all the day-to-day decisions? Or is your staff, or is the line between what your staff does and what your council does very clearly articulated? I've heard of some congregations where the council is now meeting weekly, which tells me immediately that the line between staff function and leadership function is very blurry. Did you have a crisis communication plan in place? For congregations, I think that's pretty simple, that during times of crisis, that it's only the rostered leaders and the council president that get to talk on behalf of the congregation, because sometimes, believe it or not, the finance committee or treasurer will unwittingly and not intentionally lead us to a road of scarcity instead of providing the messaging that we actually want to have out there in times like this. Is your congregation focused more on survival than mission right now? That's something we're hearing. Does the mission statement guide every decision, or does the budget guide every decision? And those are 2 very, very different ways of approaching our organizational identity and how it is we're living what we feel called to. In times of crisis, we shouldn't be living by the budget. We should be paying attention to the financial realities, but at the same time, mission should always guide what we're doing. You know, what's your council doing right now? Are they calling members to check in on them? Are they exhibiting generosity themselves, significant to their means? Are they the ones telling the stories of impact of the ministry? Or are they totally absent and you can't find them? And we'll kind of get into that. And if the budget's the only thing you're talking about, you know, then we're not talking about mission. And then as the council started to ask, you know, what's God calling us to as a result of this crisis? What new opportunities are coming about? So the crisis that we're in should have shown us much of that. And we'll be kind of exploring that as we go about through our time together. So we're going to do our first Slido event. So try this out with me, if you will. If you'll go to slido.com, open up another browser. Don't close this browser because that would be sad to lose you from the meeting. But go to that, and I am going to open up the first question. So now when you go, there should be a poll question asked. And so it's, I'm going to redo, for anybody that joined late, if you don't have it in the chat box, I'm going to put it in one more time. Okay, so voting has started. I am going to share a different screen now. So you can see the results as they come in. So the question is, how effective is your council? We've had 20 people vote so far, so we're doing okay, up to 23 now. So our average score currently is about a 3.4. Which actually feels pretty healthy. All right, I'm going to leave it open for just another minute or two. This is good first practice, and I think to get 35 to respond so far is pretty good. So we're going to do a few more questions like this throughout, but you all have rated the effectiveness of your councils at about a 3.4, which I find really good. You're either really positive or, you know, things are going fairly well with your councils already. So so interesting results. For the 36 of you that voted, thank you. For those of you that struggled with it, we'll try and walk you through it a little bit better next time to make sure that everybody can get a vote in. All right. So we have 10 steps to success, and we're going to just focus on these first three, that the council and staff are organized for effectiveness. We have our stewardship program in place and the strategic ministry vision, and they actually build on one another. So we're going to start with council effectiveness here. So a question I often ask is, how many of your council members expect that the time that they have on council will be the most fulfilling time that they have in service to the congregation? And often when I ask that question, there is a little bit of light laughter in the room. Because sometimes in our congregations, you know, you get elected to council because you happen to miss a meeting and you got nominated and elected. Or it feels like a lifetime sentence, or it doesn't feel overly fulfilling because you're not focused on the right things. I believe that if we're on a board and our council is the board of the church, that level of service should be the most fulfilling time you ever have with that organization. And we're going to talk about ways in which that can be brought about. So why boards exist? I've got two definitions here. I like the second one best. Boards are the boards of trustees are supposed to be the ultimate guardians of institutional ethos and organizational values. And so that's what the board should focus on. The board isn't only about the budget, although they do have a fiduciary responsibility. they aren't only about listening to committee reports, although committees should be working towards a strategic plan and a goal, which makes those committee reports much more valuable. And so, but it's about mission, and it's guarding that the mission is what's being moved forward. So how do you make that time fulfilling? I think you have to intentionally develop your council members. I don't think just taking who gets voted on and assuming they've got all the leadership capacity and skill to be effective board members for you is going to lead to fulfillment for them or a highly functioning board. I hear college presidents talk about spending 20 hours a week on board development issues. Now, I personally think that's a little high. However, you got to remember a college board of trustees is also normally made up of the largest donors to the college. So much of that time is also donor development in addition to board development. But if the board is really guiding the vision, then investing in the people who are guiding that vision is certainly significant and important. I am somewhat monitoring the chat box. All of these slides will be made available to you afterwards. So as much as I love to see people feverishly write notes, I will also make all these slides available to you at the end. So councils that focus on strategic and have time for generative discussion are very effective opportunities on council. And then also another key is to honor time. The congregation I served, I was there for about 4 years. Our council meetings would start at 7 and they usually ended around 11, 11:30. We always ended by midnight, whether we were done or not. And actually, I would argue we were done at about 8:15, but the meetings would often continue. And so we need to honor people's time if we want it to be fulfilling. So I always pose the question too, how many hours per month do you or should you spend developing council leaders? I don't have a Slido poll on this one, but I'd invite you to at least, I've had many pastors tell me, and roster leaders tell me, they really don't think about it. They just go to the meetings. And so if we want a more effective council, how do we find time in our schedules to devote to that development? And how much time should that be? I don't think it should be 20 hours a week. We're not the same as a college or university, but I think we should at least spend some time focused on and developing council leaders, particularly how it is during a meeting that we will work to build people up. I have to tell you that my least favorite words to ever hear when I was in the parish often happened about 6:55 p.m. on council meeting night. We would start at 7 when somebody would walk into the room and the words were, "Oh crap, I have devotions tonight." So when "oh crap, I have devotions tonight" is the statement from the person leading devotions, how fulfilling do you expect that devotion to be in leading a congregation to grow spiritually, or a council to grow spiritually, to be equipped for the growth that they need, and that time is going to be valuable time of spiritual growth. I think we need to be investing in that time. Otherwise, "oh crap, I have devotions tonight" does not usually lead to a really fulfilling devotion. So there's a guy named Carver that has written a lot on board development and why boards exist. I like a lot of what Carver says. I'm not a true Carver disciple, but says that boards set policy and then management implements. The board determines the ends, which are the goals, and then the management then figures out how to accomplish the goals. Here's where I like to say that board activity, council activity in the church is probably the hardest nonprofit board to manage and to figure out. And the reason is this: in a true nonprofit, my background is camping. So in a camp, we had a board, and then the board hired an executive director. The executive director hired the staff. It was a very clear delineation between where the board level was and then where the staff function was, because we had such a staff, and our staff did not include board members. All right. In the congregation, we have our council, we have some staff, but then management is also the chair of the worship and music committee, who may also be a member of council. And so we blur the lines significantly between where are we in corporate governance and then where are we in management activity. And so I would tell you that the board function on a congregation level is probably the most difficult to navigate because people wear so many different hats. And so that's something to be very cognizant of and to work to train your council members when they're wearing their council hat and when they're wearing their management hat. All right. I don't think we can have an effective council if we're not working from a strategic plan. We're going to talk about strategic planning this afternoon. But there's parts of the strategic plan that I think the council needs to take ownership of and leadership in. And then there's parts of the strategic plan that get left to management. But if the council functions from the strategic plan, then we assure that our council meeting isn't 2 hours of committee reports about random things, but we are working towards something. So the council should focus on vision, mission, and strategic priorities. And then the staff and teams get to focus on goals and operations. And there's a handoff that happens somewhere around goals, strategic priorities. There's a little bit of overlap there. But if the council sets the vision and mission and strategic priorities, then staff get to say, all right, you have this strategic priority. Here's how we determine we're going to implement that. And then staff can also go back to council and say, we don't have the resource, you have not allocated the resources to achieve the strategic priority that you want to. And so that's really where the functioning comes in. Where council can be fulfilling is when we focus on the right things. When council meetings are focused on how many poinsettias should be ordered, who we should order them from, and who will help put them out on the altar in Advent, your council is not focusing on the right things. And there is a council in Region 6 that had that very issue in their minutes, because I read them on the bulletin board where they're posted, because that's an effective communication tool, is to put them on the bulletin board. Actually, it's an effective way to make sure people don't read them, in my opinion. Actually, that's a hobby of mine, is when I'm in congregations, I will read the council minutes and I ask myself a single question: is the kingdom of God being advanced because of the work of the council? And if the answer is yes, then it's normally a very robust congregation doing a lot of great ministry. And if the answer is no, it typically reflects a declining congregation. And your minutes really are a statement of faith as to what is being accomplished for the kingdom of God. And so this particular congregation had about 1.25 pages filled with conversation about poinsettias at Advent, which is not the role of council. That should hardly even be the role of the worship and music committee. I mean, that should just be a task that gets accomplished. So when boards start to focus on the things that they shouldn't, we start to run into frustration. And that's where people don't necessarily want to be serving on council when we're talking about poinsettias, when we should be talking about vision and mission and strategic priorities. So there's 3 duties that we like to tell board members that they should have: a duty of care, a duty of loyalty, a duty of obedience. My favorite is the duty of care, because too often council meetings got preempted by people who wouldn't leave their personal agenda behind. They just wanted to, they had an axe to grind and they were going to grind it every meeting until they finally felt heard. Then my other issue with duty of care is that you attend regularly. If you can't make serving on a board your highest priority, then you shouldn't serve on that board. Now, I do believe that this pandemic is showing us that maybe we can also have some of our meetings not in person. And for people like me, at least pre-pandemic, where I traveled a lot, I could never serve on my congregation council because I couldn't guarantee that I would be, in town on the 3rd Monday of every month. But I could have made a commitment to be present virtually on the 3rd Monday of every month, even if I was traveling. So I think we also need to adapt how we do some meetings as well. So we have another Slido question here, and it's open-ended, but I'll share the results with you in just a moment. I do need to switch over and open the question. So the question number 2 is, who does the council represent? So same code to get into Slido, but question now is, who does the council represent? And it should be open. If any of you find that it's not, please, you can put that in the chat box. Okay, so they're coming in, so apparently they are coming. In just a moment, I'll let you see what other people are saying. So what I'm seeing, a lot of answers. We're at 30. Actually, I won't read to you yet because I want people to continue to answer as they are. So we're at 38. I'm going to go ahead and start just kind of scanning and looking, and I know you can see at least part of the screen so far. So I've seen a lot of answers, the whole congregation. Then I see mission and vision, God's mission, cross-section of the congregation. The early answerers, a lot was the congregation or the whole congregation. But I see a couple more, the mission of the church, the organization's mission, God's mission. And we've got 38 responses. So a few answered the mission, many answered the whole congregation. Some said, they represent themselves, even though they should represent others. My answer to that is they represent the mission. They don't represent the congregation. And that was an awakening I got. A book I commend to you if you want to get better at governance and leadership. I'm going to put it up. Actually, I will do this. I will stop screen sharing for a second and put it up. Governance and Ministry by Dan Hotchkiss. I thought for a while that my next book that I would write would be about governance and leadership. And then I read Dan's book and recognized that it's already been written. I don't need to. He does a phenomenal job. He's a former Alban Institute leader and talks about the idea that the council needs to represent the mission, not the congregation. It's not a democracy. We're back to that first definition I offered. The council is elected. The board is there to maintain the organizational ethos, and it's by representing the mission that happens, not by representing what loud voices in the congregation want to hear. That's difficult for people, but it's what we should be about. So Dan would argue, I would argue alongside him, that the council represents the mission of the organization, which makes strategic planning just so critical, because we need to make sure that what we're doing is representing that mission. Heather, can you help me out? I was trying to reply and I did it wrong again. I'm not going to do it twice. Dan Hotchkiss is the name of the author. Heather will shoot that out to you here in just a second. So 4 things, in order to represent the mission, 4 things that the council should do is set a clear mission, be the carriers of that mission, set those SMART goals, those strategic priorities, and then measure success and failure. And if we do those 4 things, then I think a council is functioning very, very well. And this afternoon, we're going to really get into, so how do you write a mission statement? What does that actually look like? And some things like that. So, and then also the key is to set SMART goals, not goals like, hey, we should grow, but what would that actually look like? And just so you know, here's a spoiler for this afternoon. A good strategic plan, I think, helps make ministry leadership a whole lot more tangible, and helps you to see progress towards a goal, because ministry so often is so intangible that we always think we could work more. We could always do one more thing. We could always, launch this new program or do that. A strategic plan helps to focus that and helps you systematically step towards that, so that some days you can go home and say, you know what, I did enough towards our goals today. Which I think is a very good feeling for many of us who get into ministry, who feel like we just have to do more. We just have to keep doing more things. And so a strategic plan doesn't cause more work. It causes focused work and causes us to be able to know when we're doing enough, which I think is critical. So best practices for councils. Having a consent agenda on reports and other items, okay? In a 4-hour council meeting, we would probably spend 3.5 hours on committee reports, because everybody around the table felt the need to share and validate their committee's work, that they were doing stuff. And we don't need to do that. Back to those duties of care, loyalty. If we have a duty of care, we're going to read material that comes to us. So committee reports can be written, sent out ahead of time, and we trust people to read them ahead. If your entire council meeting is just the reading of reports, you're really killing people's time. And so a consent agenda, and what a consent agenda is it comes out ahead of time and says, this is what's in the consent agenda. And we're just going to vote on this as one motion to accept it all. And by the way, Hotchkiss will tell you that you might not want to approve committee reports because then they actually become practice of the congregation. And unless you're editing those committee reports to make sure, you just may want to be careful about actually parliamentarily what you actually do with committee reports. But consent agenda just means you're not going to discuss the items. They're just going to happen. Membership transfers are probably a key one here. Do you really need to talk about who you're transferring their membership to another congregation? Just put that out in a report, put it in the consent agenda, and it just happens. And so consent agenda allows for just a single vote on a number of items. And this is probably, when I do a workshop on council leadership, the one thing the lay people really gravitate to and really want to have happen. And it can save tons of time in a meeting, and it keeps you, and it allows space then. My goal isn't less time. My goal is that we focus on the right things. And so consent agenda allows us to put our time and energy into the right things. Anything can be pulled from consent agenda. So if there's something in there that somebody wants to talk about, it can be pulled out and then it is discussed under the area of new business. Best practices are ministry minutes, or minutes that reflect that your ministry is expanding the kingdom of God. One of the things too, I always like for every council meeting to have a purpose. I've sometimes asked a question, how often does your council meet and why do they meet that frequently? And occasionally the Constitution mandates that you meet monthly. I don't believe that to be in the model Constitution to have a monthly meeting. Most nonprofit boards don't meet monthly. I used to be under the perception that monthly was too frequently, until a pastor told me that they have to meet monthly because the leadership development that is taking place requires that rhythm and that monthly opportunity. And if that's the answer, by all means, you should meet monthly. The problem with a monthly meeting is sometimes you don't work on the strategic, you work on poinsettias on the altar in that case. And so I want to make sure that there is that balance. So you should meet often enough that you have a purpose for a meeting. If you can't define a purpose for a meeting, you should cancel the meeting immediately, or decide that your strategic plan isn't robust enough and you should be working on that. Because everybody knows what happens in a meeting that doesn't have a purpose, right? You focus on stuff you'd rather not be focused on. All right, that's where we get into trouble, is when we don't have a purpose. Your board members need to know your mission and core values. Core values, I think, are critical for congregations. We're going to talk about those this afternoon. Focused on the strategic plan, leadership development is focused on and worked on during meetings, and then council members are recruited for the gifts they bring, not because they're the only willing person. And then those gifts are affirmed and utilized. So if you're considering, if one of your strategic priorities is getting the word out to your community, you probably want somebody on your council with some public relations, communications, marketing background, right? So recruiting somebody to your council with those gifts is a great thing, but then never giving them the opportunity during the meeting to talk about, the strategic initiative that they were recruited to have that voice on the council for, is kind of telling them that your gifts aren't really that important. And we just kind of duped you into getting on here by telling you that was the reason we recruited you. And by the way, council recruitment happens so much better when you do have a reason to recruit somebody to your board. We look for diversity on boards, and there are several kinds of diversity that we tend to focus on: gender, economic, language other than English, those sorts of things. But there is also diversity of talents, that sometimes it might be great to have an attorney on your board. Sometimes it might be great to have somebody with communication skill. Diversity can be beyond the things that we tend to report on. But diversity could be that, hey, we need a new member to give us some ideas as to why they might have joined. So there's all kinds of different diversities that we can look at. But when you recruit somebody for that purpose, they are more likely to say yes. But then you need to make sure that what you recruited them for is utilized during the meetings. These questions to ask after a board meeting. Was the purpose of the meeting clearly articulated? Did we accomplish that purpose? And if you can get council members to honestly respond to that, your meetings will become more effective. Were all council members prepared for the meeting? If you're talking about a report that was sent out ahead of time and it becomes obvious that people didn't read it, people should be held accountable for not living up to that expectation that you're going to read things before the meeting starts. Did we tell stories of how God is active through the congregation and in the world? I believe that Lutherans don't evangelize well because we don't provide people the stories that are worth sharing. Oftentimes the most proclaimed story in a congregation is how far behind the budget we are, and nobody's going to share that with a friend. And so to model, my favorite way to start a council meeting is that people are not allowed to come in and sit down. Everybody remains standing, and you have a 5-minute standing meeting to start. And the 5-minute standing meeting is sharing stories of what God's been up to in the ministry of the congregation for the last month. And then you spend the next 10 minutes, each council member calls 2 families to share those stories. And so in that, you're training your council members. Well, first you're making sure that stories of what God's activity is in the congregation are being shared. And then you're training your council members how to tell the story. But if we never tell them the story and never teach them how to share the story, of course we're not going to become evangelists. So I think we need to stop saying that Lutherans are bad evangelists. I think Lutherans, maybe, and many Protestants, are bad at teaching our members what our story is and how to share that story. And so anyway, that's a little bit of my soapbox that I tend to get on every once in a while. Here's a model council agenda for you. Call to order, devotions, consent agenda, the items removed from consent, approval of the consent, update on the strategic plan, generative discussion. Generative discussion is a discussion that you have just for the sake of having the discussion, not to answer a question or not to come to a resolution with, a motion. A generative discussion like right now could very well be, hey, what do you think God's calling us to as we've lived in a pandemic now for 6 or 7 weeks? What are the new things that are emerging that need to stick around? Like I hear a lot of congregations talking about, well, maybe we need to keep virtual worship afterwards because people seem to be engaging that. Well, a great question for the council would be, okay, let's say we keep it. For what purpose would we keep it? Because whatever that purpose is going to depend on how exactly we do it. Whether it's a live stream of our worship service in the sanctuary, or whether it's, you know, creation of a 30-minute service for busy people who can't make it to worship that day. So until you define the purpose, you don't know what you're creating. I would love to have a leadership group like a council that could have a generative discussion on that issue to help figure that out. And I think council members would love, at least people like me, if they're on your council, would love to be part of that discussion to help shape what it would be. So that's what a generative discussion is, and that's how they can be very effective right now. And then the final thing you do is items for new business with a preliminary discussion, and then you have old business. One of the things Hotchkiss will say is you should never have a motion brought up and also vote on it in the same meeting, because that's when uninformed discussion happens. And it's also when there are people, I'm not going to throw the Synod under the bus, but there is one Synod represented here who at least used to have a member of Synod Council who just wanted to argue with everything. But by bringing it up first, and then giving time for education and information, will actually allow then when it comes up the following month or 2 months later, a much better chance of approval because people aren't being blindsided by it. And so I thought that was a very helpful concept that Hotchkiss brought up as well in his book. So that's my model council agenda. So take a look at your situation, look at your minutes. Where do they reflect people growing in faith or learning about ministry outcomes? Look at your minutes. What did you spend too much time to? It's often the financial report. And I am not saying that we don't need to know what our finances are. But I think in many congregations, finances have taken over and they become the limiting factor. Leadership needs to know what the finances are and then make decisions based on what we know. Not that we can't do anything because we don't have any money. Well, part of the reason we often don't have any money is because we don't know what we want to do. And so it's that never-ending cycle downward. Leaders will lead through scarcity into abundance. And then too often we get bogged down in tactics and not into mission and vision. And then how can we do better? One of the greatest things, I was on the National Church Council, and one of the things I appreciated most about that time, there was plenty that frustrated me, but one of the things that I appreciated most about that time, we would evaluate every plenary session that we would have, which is the equivalent of a council meeting. And we would look at, you know, first, were the things we were talking about the things we should be talking about? But then we would also call out people who were hanging out on Facebook, like, you know, who weren't really present, which would actually cause the meetings to go longer and not be focused. And even things like, was the room comfortable enough to have the meeting in? So to really evaluate, are we doing the right things? Do we have what we need to do our job? And what's getting in our way? And to do that honestly, and it was brutally honest. I mean, I remember the first time people got called out for Facebook. I fortunately wasn't sitting where that could be seen, but I didn't get on much anymore because I didn't want to be publicly called out for not being prepared and not participating in the meeting. And it did make our meetings much more fulfilling, valuable, and on target. And if we weren't doing the things that we should have been doing, it was often, you know, we had to look at ourselves too. Was it my fault for not saying we weren't doing the right thing? I'm a leader here. What's my responsibility to make sure we're doing the things that we should be doing? So I've got another poll for you. I'll open it up here in just a second. So what's the ideal size for a congregation council? So again, it's a Slido poll. And right now it looks like we have 38 folks who are able to vote and are voting. So in just a minute, I'll switch my screen share so you can see what people think. We've got 20 in, I think that's. So we got 37% of you think it's 6 to 7 people, and that includes the rostered folks. All of these numbers would include the rostered folks. Over half of you think 8 to 9, and then nobody thinks 14 plus. There's a council in North Carolina that has 20 people on it, or no, 24 people on it. I think that's nuts personally. I would never serve that congregation, but that's just me. So 3% say 12 to 13, 8% 10 to 11. Majority of you are saying 8 to 9. Hotchkiss will tell you the answer is 7. I'm not saying you have to do everything he says. He's saying it's 7. And the reason he says that, and I see a couple last minute votes coming in. Oh no, that went to 8 to 9. I thought people were just voting based on what I told you Hotchkiss said. So Hotchkiss will say that that's the reason for 7 in his mind, is that 7 is small enough that people aren't going to skip a meeting because they know they'll be missed. If you have a council with 12 to 13 people on it and you miss a meeting, nobody notices, right? Or they might notice, but meeting carries on. If you have a council of 7 and somebody misses, people are going to ask you where you were. The other reason he likes 7 is that it helps to assure that you aren't representing, like, I'm here to represent the worship and music committee. And so I'm going to advocate everything worship and music. When you have a number of 7, well, and obviously it's an odd number, you're not going to have tie votes. When you only have 7 people, the congregation's bigger than that. And so it also means that you can't just be there to represent worship and music because nobody's representing every different group in the congregation, that you have to be there to represent the mission. I am much more inclined. So the National Church Council, I think at one point had like 43 people on it when I was on. It was a transition year. Far too many people to be a governing board to focus just on the strategic. I would have loved to have been on a National Church Council of 7 people. I don't think we'll ever get there. But I think Congregation Council, I think 7's a great number. I agree with Hotchkiss. I think it should be far less than 24, okay? I think we had 15 on the council I was parish pastor with, far too many people. Everybody came in with their own agenda thinking they were representing their group of friends. So just something to think about as you look at that. So when I graduated seminary, the big debate was on, do we have committees or do we have teams? And you know what we did? We quit having committees and we had teams, but you know what they were? They were committees called teams. There was nothing different than what the title was. And just giving something a new name doesn't change how it is. Hotchkiss gets into this as well. Committees are for governance. Committees are the things that need to last forever, and they help you do governance. And he names 4 of them. There's a finance committee, a nominating committee, a personnel committee, and a governance committee. Those are 4 teams or 4 committees that report directly to the council. Teams report directly to the staff. And that's his difference. Remember at the beginning, we talked about the difference between being in the strategic and being, the difference between strategic priority and the difference in tactics and implementing a goal. And management is in the tactics and implementing a goal. And so the teams, because staff are the leaders of implementing the goals and tactics, then teams report to staff, whereas committees report to the board. I think if we do that, it becomes much more clear who does what and where that difference comes in between governance and between management. So the other thing you'll see, I said, don't limit it to the. So if you have the education committee and all of a sudden somebody wants to launch a new adult opportunity, but the education committee says, oh, we're too busy to do that. Well, you have no other place to be nimble to start something new. But if it's a team, you could say, all right, so the education team isn't going to do this new thing, but we're just going to launch another team that's going to be an adult education team, and they're going to do adult education stuff. It allows you to be more nimble to go in new directions. So I don't like to put the in front of any team that I have because it says there'll never be another one or there'll never be an offshoot. Teams need to be nimble to achieve goals. I have a couple real life examples. I'm just going to do one of these, and because I'd like to do a few minutes of questions before we break. But this one comes up a lot. I had a council that was stuck on an $800 issue. Finally, somebody said, here's $100. If all of you will give a gift, you know, according to your means, I'm confident we'll have the $800. We can move on. Too often, scarcity mentality just seeps in, and we say we can't do anything because it's not in the budget. And so what happens, we need a leader to lead and get us through those kinds of things. And actually, I will drop to one final thing. I like to create a dashboard, you know, because whatever we monitor is what we're saying is most important to us. In many congregations, the only thing we monitor is revenue and expenses. And so that's the only measurement of whether we're being successful or not. And actually, I think if we're only monitoring revenue and expenses, and if a balanced budget is a goal, I think we've totally lost our mission. But if attendance is important to us, we should monitor it, and monitor on a weekly basis. There's a big church in Wisconsin that had 2 campuses that I worked with, and they discovered that one of their campuses was declining in attendance. And what they recognized, because they monitored it every week, they could see the trend very clearly. It wasn't just somebody saying, hey, I think attendance is down in Verona. They monitored it every week. They had data. And then what they were able to do is say, you know, why might that be? They had a generative discussion, and they determined that because they had no staff that were actually responsible for the Verona campus. Nobody was investing the time and energy into it. They switched that. Now the Verona campus is the faster growing of the 2. So we need to determine what's important to us and then monitor that and pay attention to it, because what we pay attention to is what we care most about. So whether we state that or not. So we got a few minutes here. I think we should take some questions and see where we are. You can either put those. Why don't we just put those in the chat box? That's probably the easiest way with a group this size. And just so you know, this will be far more exciting if you do give some questions. Specific things for board and council development. I think one of the best things you can do for board and council development is read a book together. Maybe don't just read Hotchkiss' book yourself, get it for your council. You know, my book talks a little bit about it, about council development, also gets into strategic planning and stewardship. Could be another way to go. I think reading a book together, having a book study and letting that be some of your discussion time at a council meeting could be great. I think Hotchkiss' book might be a little long for that. Somebody read Canoeing the Mountains. Excellent book. You're going to hear more about that as I talk about strategic planning later. But read a book together. Otherwise, how are they? I mean, that's a way for them to see trends. Or there's the group Living Every Day as Disciples has their 10-minute toolbox that is designed to start a council meeting with. Watch their 10-minute toolbox and have discussion on that. That's another way to do council development. And then one-on-one, you know, one-on-one leadership coaching from you or someone else with folks can be a great way to go. So what size congregation are these ideas directed to? Actually, it fits across many. The larger the congregation already tends to be the smaller the council. The corporate size congregations that we have out there are already at council size of 7 or 8 people. You know, the way in which you implement from a family congregation to a program congregation, you know, is going to be different. But honestly, many of these principles cross over. Now, Hotchkiss will get a whole lot into operating procedures that if you're in a family-sized congregation, you probably don't need to mess with. But in a corporate-sized congregation, you absolutely have to work on. So I honestly, you know, I think many of these principles cross over, but certainly the more corporate, the more you have to act as a corporate. Implementation can just look different. So I love the 10-minute toolbox. I led a 10-minute one on stewardship about 3 or 4 years ago. I think they've got some great resources to start this conversation, and Lauren put that into the chat box there for you. So good. Other questions? Yeah. So probably the first thing you do shouldn't be to go to the next council meeting and say, we need to rewrite our bylaws and go to 7 people on the council. That's probably not step one. I do think if you want to, I think consent agenda can be adopted quickly and lead to great excitement. Please, though, when you move to consent agenda, don't just move to a 35-minute council meeting. I think move to implementing some generative discussion. I mean, and for you to, as a leader, to say, hey, folks, I think God's calling us to something through this pandemic. What's the future for us for virtual worship? We're not going to make a decision today. We're just going to have a conversation about it and give people some space to start to experiment with some of these things. But consent agenda is probably the quickest thing that will lead you to more space. You may need to do a little bit of conversation, though, about duty of care that says you're going to read your stuff before you come, because I don't want anybody voting on things that they've not seen before, because that's, failure of duty. So I think that's a fine place to start. I think changing the size of your council in most contexts is going to be a couple-year process, unless you just want to rip off the Band-Aid and let the chips fall where they may. Not a model I typically recommend, and I think the bishops are probably still on the call, and they're probably not going to recommend that either. But I think you can lead people through a process. I have a congregation that I'm working with right now, reading Dan's book, and it's already led to 3 significant changes on the council level. And we're doing their strategic plan right now, which is going to further allow for that change and shift to happen. Good. Other questions for this topic? So I'm not able to see the count while I'm in presenter mode, but 53 of you hung in there till now, so it wasn't that dreadful, apparently. You're probably all caught up on email, though, so that's good too. So, yeah, I guess as I'm watching the chat box too, all of this is built on trust, right? The higher the trust level, the more change can happen, but also good communication. And so if trust is high, you can certainly lead people more quickly to a new place. And this presentation is being recorded. You're welcome to share this with your folks. And maybe I can be the one to help convince people that they at least need to start thinking about things differently. Yeah, best resource about developing council members. I'll try and find a couple more resources I can bring back to you at the later meeting. There's an organization that may or may not still be in business called BoardSource, and that's where a lot of my books came from. The Corporate Person is one. We love that in the nonprofit world. I haven't reflected on it to see how it translates to church. And so sometimes you have to read a book and translate it to your context. That might work for a camp or a social service agency, but it doesn't work in the congregational context. It could be another way to go. So there's a question, what's the best way to address members who don't want to hear that the church is also a business? I'm going to give you a lot of this in the next section. Strategic plan, the first step of a strategic plan is identity. As long as your mission, your vision, your core values are your identity, business language doesn't matter, okay? Business language is anathema to many when it's more about, when it's misunderstood that it's about profits and that sort of thing. If you know your identity, I think the business world has a ton to teach us in the church about how we can do ministry better. applying what they do in the business world to our mission. And that to me is the key on that. So as long as we know our identity, then the business stuff, in my opinion, isn't that big a deal. They have a lot to teach us where we can be more effective. And so there is a request for my cats. So I used to travel a lot until about May 15th, I think. And when I would leave, my office became a cat foster room. And so Zelda is the fortunate one that's gotten stuck with me ever since the quarantine took place. And she pretty much spends the entire meetings in my lap. So Zelda's available for adoption if anybody would like her. You know, and Bob, she is not a jerk. So just so you know. I think we're to the end of the time we said we were going to keep you, and I do like to honor time commitments. We'll do a lot more on Q&A after the next session. So Heather, I'm going to kick it back to you. I'm going to call it quits there.
Thank you, Mike. I certainly appreciated some of the a lot of the information that you presented. People are thanking you in the comments, and I'm looking forward to our afternoon session. Again, we'll be back at 1 p.m. Same link. So go either take a walk, do some emails, do whatever you need to do for a little bit, and we'll see everybody back at 1 o'clock. Bye.